I'm John Davidson, and today we are with Christine Dolan, author of the new book, Urban Legends, and Robert Morton, founder of the World Tribune. Welcome.
Thanks, John.
Thanks. Good to be here, John.
Christine, let's talk a little bit about this book. Christine, what is this book about, and why did you write it?
I wrote it because of a conversation that I had with a guy named Dennis Carroll in June of 2021. I had been talking to him since early 2020. He's part of the Coronavirus Hunters Club, as I call them, the people that go out to bat caves. And I had been talking to him on and off, and I said to him about a year and a half into our conversations, so what do you think of the rollout? And this is June of 2021. And he said to me that they needed to do better on their message, that the COVID vaccinations stop the transmissibility of COVID and it would block getting the disease. Now, we know that changed a good year later because I did an interview with him on camera. But the second question I asked him, and I had been interviewing vaccinated since January of 2021, and I asked Dennis, well, what about the vaccine injuries, COVID vaccine injuries? And he said, well, Christine, they're urban legends. And I said, well, wait a minute. I've been talking to them for, a good 6 months. And he said to me, well, look at Christine, if we have 3 million shots and there's 325,000 people with blood clots, we have treatment for blood clots. And that's when I just tore into him and said, try that on somebody else. Because everybody that I have been speaking with for the first 6 months of 2021, most of them were in the healthcare industry, nurses, doctors, surgeons, dental hygienists, and they all had multiple injuries at the time. And he just blew it off. And that's when I said, okay, I needed to produce a film, which I did. It was like a 4-minute film. We released that, and it went on the internet. We released it in an event in late July of 2021 in Atlanta. And then I just decided that, these people were not going to be helped and they needed to go on camera. And that's when I did a series of Vax-Injured on camera. But at the same time, I decided to do a book because I never believed that the powers that be were going to officially acknowledge the vascular and neurological injuries, which they have not done to date. Now it's 2026. And so this is their story about the fraud, the COVID origin, the vaccine injured, the people who didn't take the shots but filed for religious and medical exemptions. And I threw in a whole section with contributors on the transgender pseudoscience, because that's not going away either. And so it's a book to be in people's faces. I name names who profits from this monstrosity that we call coronavirus research, why they did the cover up and what they didn't want people to do, why they lied to us and said that, they're safe and effective when they're not safe and effective for everybody. And the continued cover-up, as much as we've received so far, because we now know that there has been research, documentations, and downsliding of adjectives to describe even strokes for the elderly during the rollout. And also the hidden information from the Pfizer documents that they didn't want people to see for 75 years, and also the way that Moderna characterizes itself as a tech company involved with biology. So it's a full gamut of, there's enough there that people need to watch this, because I do believe it's going to play out again. I believe that Operation Warp Speed is absolutely in line, because we haven't shut down these laboratories that are unregulated all over the world. And we also know that Vax is the answer, according to these people, for any pathogen that emerges. And I do believe that the Trump administration has to officially acknowledge these neurological and vascular injuries, because and take some blame here. And people need to be prosecuted. I firmly believe people need to be prosecuted because of the fraud that happened behind the scenes.
Could I just ask Christine, taking a step back, I believe the Urban Legends is the third part of a trilogy. Is that correct?
It is. When I got upset about this, my publisher suggested that I also just cover human trafficking, because this book is really on medical trafficking. If you force, coerce, defraud, lie to anybody, it doesn't matter whether it's sex or whether it's labor, whether it's on the street, whether it's across the internet, whether it's sex tourism, whether it's organ trafficking, And so the first, this is one of 3 books. The first book is Shattered Innocence, and that goes to my first human trafficking investigation back in 2000, and I brought it fast forward because the numbers are going up. The whole model that we've used has been downstream and reactive as opposed to preventative and proactive at the top of that. And the second book is In the Name of God, which is about the Catholic Church going back to 2001. And fast forward to where we are today. And even since these 2 books came out in 2024, and even today in the Catholic Church, there's an $800 million settlement in New York Diocese and a $300 million settlement in Buffalo. So that's still an ongoing story. And this COVID story is going to be an ongoing story because these people think that vax is the only answer to everything. There was a meeting last week in DC where people are now talking about doing a cancer vaccination. Well, thank you very much. The COVID vaccine actually caused an increase in what we call turbo cancer, which is skipping stage 1 and 2, going to 3 and 4. And now they're talking about a cancer vaccine. So, and they're talking about the same business model, which is to accelerate the manufacturing of vaccinations and skipping phase 3 of the clinical trials, which is exactly what the model was in 2020. We can all blame Biden for the mandates, but the acceleration model happened under Trump 1. And that happened because of Bob Kadlec and all at the HHS, whose job was his job was, I forget his job title, but it was basically to cover the preparedness of responding to the pandemics. And then he did it with Peter Marks at the FDA, and they sold it to Jared at the White House, who took it to Trump, who signed off on it. And that's why we have Operation Warp Speed. But it started way before COVID. It goes back 20 years ago when Bill Fritz was then Senate Majority Leader, talking about how we, in fact, needed to have something akin to the Manhattan Project 2 in response to these emerging pathogens. And Kadlec at that point in time, in 2004-05, was our bioterrorist expert for the baby Bush administration. So this is not something that just, creeped up on us. People have been talking about this for a long time. So I get into some of this history in urban legends, but I want people to understand it's a business model. It doesn't get into the science. It mentions the mortality numbers that people should not, look away, but they also have to understand the cover-up. The cover-up was purposeful. It was intentional. And they went after the ivermectin, they went after the hydroxychloroquine, so that vax was the only answer for the response. And it includes an examination of remdesivir and how that happened and the papers that these people wrote that they would hold up at the White House briefings with Fauci and then let it slip into and basically take over legacy media for some of these papers that they published. And it wasn't something that just happened organically. It was planned. And that's what people have to understand.
Speaking of business models, I think, Kristen, you're part of the story here, because the so-called legacy media and the role they have played in all of these issues that have written about have been a major player. They've been a major part of it. And at some point, you, as a former award-winning member of the so-called legacy media, CNN and others, went your own way. So at what point could you describe for us, at what point did these stories become too uncomfortable for the legacy media, and what prompted you to go off on your own, and why are you still alive? I could also ask that.
Well, I put a chapter in the book, what happened to the media in urban legends. And the truth is that everybody in legacy media lost the keys to the archives. And I actually give some I write about some historical campaigns where the media really did do their job. And they took on science, and they understood and they reported on sterilization programs here in the United States. And apologies came down from President Clinton, President Obama, acknowledgement of what we did when we did we didn't just have the Tuskegee syphilis program here that was recognized and acknowledged in the 1970s. We also did one in Guatemala that was acknowledged, and the same people were involved. during the Obama administration is when we discovered that. So I take on the media. I'm not somebody that thinks that they bought into Pfizer, made to you by, but at the same time, it's a consideration. But the most important thing is they became very lazy. They didn't want to go up against the narrative. They didn't want to go up against politics. They didn't want to challenge any of these people. And why I'm still standing is because I'm irreverent. And I've never backed down from challenging, people who are in positions of power. And I think it's a disservice because actually I think part of our industry was complicit. I mean, there was only one person in the world I wanted to talk to in 2020, and we all know this as investigative journalists. You want to talk to somebody who knows more than you do, and it doesn't matter what side of the story they're on. And the person I wanted to talk to in 2020 was Bobby Kennedy because I wasn't buying what everybody was saying. I was thinking to myself, everybody I was talking to all over the world was telling me vax was the only answer, and I kept on thinking, why? Why is vax the only answer? And I was talking to doctors, and these are doctors internationally that were telling me, Christine, you don't understand who Fauci is. And I said, tell me about him. Now, Fauci's married to a gal who was ahead of me at Georgetown. So I know Christine Grady, decades ago. But at the same time, when you get into the weeds of the players that are involved and the fact that Fauci has been part of the federal government as long as J. Edgar Hoover, he's going to have an influence generationally about who works for some of these agencies. And then the thing I think I found frustrating in 2020 as the fraud story started to reveal itself is that people didn't say, we need to have an independent investigation. I mean, this was a colossal, horrible situation that impacted 8 billion people. And there were no world leaders except for a couple who basically said, we need to have an investigation. And China pushed back. There's no doubt about it. China pushed back. But people should have sat back and said, we're not going to do business with China. Okay, but here's the thing. Most of those people who I spoke to were never subpoenaed on Capitol Hill. Dashik was subpoenaed, but there's a whole lot of other Dashiks that are out there. Has Dashik given up on this game for vax is the only answer for all these emerging pathogens that are in the bat caves? No. Not only that, but they were working in partnership with China. And that's what people don't understand. We knew that the PREDICT project under USAID had morphed into what they call the Global Virome Project. And we know that the Global Virome Project was morphing into the Thai Virome Project and the China Virome Project. And that people in our government were going along with doing business with China for this emerging pathogen business model through the Brick Road initiative that she had set up. And there were meetings in 2017, 18, and 19 in China, and I put it in the book. And I've named the names of the people that benefit from this. It's not just pharma. It's disruptive markets. It's not just the Gates Foundation. It's the Skoll Foundation. It's not just pharma. It's agriculture. It's mining. So there's a lot of big players and a lot to lose. But again, the laboratories where they take these specimens to are not regulated. And the U.S. owns 25% of the global market of the lab 4s, the ones with the most dangerous pathogens. And they're in urban areas and they're in rural areas. Western Europe has a lot of them. I think there's 4 down in Australia. But these people, they transport these pathogens. And we just had an arrest of a guy named Munster up at Rocky Mountain. I think it's in the last month. But we also have Chinese scientists working at a Michigan lab. They were arrested in the last year. So we don't have a handle on this. And people aren't talking about this in Washington, D.C. And that's why when other people focused on the vaccines and the science, I went for the business model because trafficking, whether it's medical, organs, sex, labor, it's always a business. And that's where we need to focus on this, because this business model is a danger for the human race.
Christine, in the last few weeks, we've had releases from Tulsi Gabbard on her way out the door. She dropped the mic on Fauci. We've had Rand Paul subpoena Fauci because Fauci refused to come in on his own.
Oh, I'd drag him in there. I honest to God, I'd hog tie him to get him up on Capitol Hill and make him talk.
Now, Fauci received a preemptive pardon for all crimes committed from 2014 to 2024. But there were more than just Fauci involved at the NIH. There's a whole legion of employees. What do we know about them?
Well, it's kind of interesting. There was a woman who was with FDA who came out last year, and she talked about the fact that she was pregnant at the time, and she knew that there was a danger, but she said it was very difficult for people with the FDA to have a voice up there. And I think it probably was hard for some people, but at the same time, when does it become easy? If somebody wants to kill people, if they want to use people as medical guinea pigs, I don't understand why anybody's sitting on the bench. I mean, this is like Germany in the 1930s, as far as I'm concerned. There were a lot of people that knew about this. And some people say, well, it's too big, to hold people accountable. I don't think that it is at all. I think that we just have to, really get the prosecutors in the room at this point. And, Fauci may have gotten his pardon, and yes, it's an auto pen, and yes, they could indict him, and then they'd have to go through the motion to dismiss because of the auto pen pardon. But what about Francis Collins? Francis Collins was on some of these phone calls when they were concocting some of these papers to build the narrative that COVID came from nature as opposed to the lab, when they all knew damn well that it didn't. And see, another thing is, John, when you bring up what Tulsi talked about, we know from the documents that, in fact, people were sick in the fall of 2019. Now, we all were told that this emerged in December, but we know from the documents, and we know from people don't even realize that we had a consulate in Wuhan. We didn't just have an embassy in Beijing. And I put this in the book, which was some reflections by our people in the consulate in Wuhan at the time, in the fall of 2019. And people did know that 3 people, in fact, were sick. They had COVID symptoms. And even though the lab is saying, Dr. Shi is saying, no, Ben Hugh was not sick, she can deny it. But the thing is, our people came to the conclusion that, in fact, they were sick. So the Chinese didn't tell us the truth in the very beginning, even though Fauci and his people that were saying this came from nature were saying, oh, but they're being cooperative. No, they weren't. They weren't being transparent whatsoever.
We're on the heels of probably the largest propaganda campaign ever committed on the people of Earth, safe and effective. Billions of dollars were spent by COVID Community Corps across all media to push that narrative. Do you think it's even possible for juries to understand this concept and overcome that level of propaganda for prosecutors to even hope to achieve a victory in a case like this?
I don't know.
Or in cases like this?
I don't know if you can prosecute for censorship the way that you can, but you can, the intent.
Well, I mean, the juries are influenced by this propaganda. So if you come to them and say, hey, this thing was killing people, they're going to cross-reference with what they were programmed with and say, this doesn't fit. This doesn't fit what I was told by my government.
Well, I mean, so governments, what makes people think that the American public or the American government is above being a third world country? We have propaganda all the time. This is a business model.
Well, I think
I'm just looking at it from a prosecutor.
The whole issue of legacy media and social media, because so many people are tuning out the legacy media and making up their own mind from often unvetted sources on the internet. But because of the overwhelming power of the narrative in the political class and the media class, as John pointed out, the juries are, depending where they're located, are are going to be tainted.
There was a study that somebody sent me this morning. It was a country by country study, and the amount of the percentage of increase of mortalities post the rollout. And I think there was less vaccines in Africa, and they had the smallest percentage of mortalities. But for those parts of the world where you had a high percentage of COVID vaccines given, huge 400, 1,000% increase in mortality. So when people say, and this is important for everybody in the White House, when the President of the United States met with Ron Johnson said this to some Australian reporters, that when Johnson showed the President Trump the VAERS report, and that was his chart is 30 years prior to COVID, there were more VAERS reports post rollout of the COVID vaccines than there were 30 years collectively prior to that time. And the president allegedly said to Ron Johnson, well, the Democrats think that the shots saved 100 million lives. We can't prove that. We can't prove that. And apparently Ron Johnson also showed it in the spring of 2021 to Francis Collins, who was then head of NIH. And he definitively said, according to Johnson, that, well, people die. So we get this mentality of collateral damage. That's like the military saying, okay, we're going to declare war on X, Y, and Z, and what's the collateral damage? That's not how science should be working. Science never should have been working in April of 2020 when Fauci came out and said, oh, we're going to use remdesivir because you'll spend less days in the hospital. When the former CEO of remdesivir, a guy named Morton, who has since passed away, days after that announcement by Fauci, said that remdesivir had not been approved any place in the world. And yet, Fauci pushed remdesivir. University of Chicago did some clinical tests. China did some clinical tests on remdesivir. That was shut down because they allegedly couldn't find enough people for the Chinese study. But we pushed remdesivir from April on. And then WHO came out in the fall of 2020 and said that remdesivir wasn't acceptable. But we kept on pushing it here in the United States. So these conflicting narratives, decisions, who's on first, who's on second, this isn't an Abbott and Costello comedy act. People's lives were at stake. We killed a lot of people in the hospitals because of the protocols. When doctors lost their jobs because they were putting together ivermectin, zinc, and some other alternative medicines, and their hospitals said to them, no, you have to follow our protocols, and people died. So this is a level of a discussion we need to face reality, because why is it okay that we're in the business of killing people?
Oh, they're still giving remdesivir.
I know.
Today.
Yeah. And it doesn't work. It shuts down your organs. So, I mean, these conversations shouldn't be tough. They should be conversations demanding of us. Like, what the hell happened here? And do we want it to happen again? I think if we all ask the real question, do we want to live through another COVID? The answer would be no. How do we prevent that? We have to start telling the truth.
It's just amazing how people have somehow forgotten or don't want to think about it anymore. It was only 6 years ago, and it was a horror story.
And it's only 5 years ago when
anecdotally, that people I talked to, almost universally, people, they understand what was going on. They just don't want to talk about it in polite company, as you said.
Well, then
I'm looking forward to reading the book, and it needs to get out there. The excerpts that we run, I hope that others will also run excerpts, because this discussion needs to happen at a high level.
I think it's embarrassing that we only have Rand Paul Senator Marshall, who's a doctor, and Ron Johnson on the Hill really pushing for this. I think this is a bigger story. And you know, Jeffrey Epstein is
It's the
in my
it's the
wheel,
biggest
but
story.
this is bigger than Jeffrey Epstein.
It's the biggest story.
Mm-hmm.
It was global. In fact, it was, I think, probably aside from World War II, maybe the only time the entire planet was affected by a single event. And it's like biblical. It's like
Well,
Revelations level stuff.
In early 2020, World Tribune and our newsletter, Geostrategy Direct, were making references to the bioweapon aspect of the whole issue in Wuhan. And, you know, most media denied to take that out, but this is a huge story, and it goes beyond that. It goes, you know, it involves the media, because this is a worldwide messaging operation. And it's arguably biowarfare that the U.S. had a role in developing at the University of North Carolina, nearby here where I am as well. And this is an unresolved issue 6 years later.
And there's nobody
And
held
it's
accountable.
historical. It's historical. It's a historical event.
And to be covered up and swept under the rug just seems astounding to me.
Think of all the money that went into this. Think about all the people that knew that when they were putting out papers in 2020 and saying that it didn't come from a lab, and they reinforced it. You know, how I came into this story was I was looking, because the way that a cover-up works, we're just trained this way. I mean, I was trained as a criminal investigator a zillion years ago. But you always, the cover-up happens as the story breaks, as the scandal becomes known. But you have to go back in time to figure it out. The warnings were all there. I think that there were plenty of people that were afraid to speak out in Washington, D.C. But it's not like they didn't know about it in the labs all over the world. We had a whole program under Obama from 2009 to 2019 called PREDICT at USAID that set up labs, universities, that built a consortium of international scientists to go out into the field. We had 30 countries that we created these programs in. And that was just the U.S. It would, you know, I'm not even talking about the Metabaya guys that were in Ukraine. We're just the PREDICT guys alone, but they overlapped. And many of those people that had a vested interest financially in this business model were the same people who were writing all these crazy papers that were getting printed and saying, oh no, this happened, this didn't come from a lab. We don't have specimens like this in a lab. Well, the truth of the matter was that when PREDICT was shut down in 2019, they actually shipped some of their specimens to Wuhan. And Wuhan had a large amount of specimens that were very, very dangerous. And they didn't have the capacity for the safety. And even Barrick agreed with that. So Dashik was saying, oh, no, Dr. She's, you know, she's a saint, et cetera, et cetera. She denied it. But the truth of the matter was we were in partnership with them, and Dashik was attending these meetings in China to expand this program under the Verone Project with the Chinese up until 2019. So it's not like people didn't know. Our ambassador, Terry Branston, former governor of Iowa, was Trump 1's ambassador to China. I quote from his communication to Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in the book about what was going on and the partnership between the Chinese and the U.S. government. So people knew, but they weren't talking about it. And I think that people need to understand this isn't a matter of Democrat versus Republican. This is Washington, D.C., putting people's lives at risk.
There's also the involvement of the U.S. intelligence community, right on up almost to the present, being totally complicit and involved in the narrative, development of the narrative, justifying the narrative. It's a huge story.
It's a huge story, and we don't have all the answers to it. But Jim Erdman, who's also in the book, was one of the people that was brought in to Tulsi Gabbard's group And I actually met some of these folks a couple of years ago. They came up to me and said, "Hey, can we talk?" Because it seemed that I knew a little bit more about the business model of this than they did at the time. And Jim went public. He was a whistleblower. He testified before Rand Paul's committee in the last, I guess, 6 weeks ago. And, he explained something that, a lot of people, whether or not, because sometimes I'm too close to the weeds to understand sometimes what the public knows and doesn't know. But the value of what he testified to is the fact that Tulsi at DNI, overseeing the intelligence agencies, had requested from the CIA documentation, and the CIA refused to turn over those documents. Now, we know that the Predict Project, USAID, and some other agencies didn't want to turn documents over to the committees up on Capitol Hill. But the interesting thing about Tulsi Gabbard is that it's John Ratcliffe who now runs the agency. And it's his agency that didn't want to turn these documents over to NDI at Tulsi's agency. But John Ratcliffe used to run NDI under Trump 1. So why wouldn't the CIA want to turn over those documents now, when the president has basically said, let's get to the bottom of this by an executive order? So you've got people in our government who are basically ignoring the wishes of the White House. And then the question comes down is, who's running the White House and who's got a stake in the game for pharma? And we keep on seeing, since Trump has come back into office, we see Bola. What is Bola doing? The CEO of Pfizer. He was down at Mar-a-Lago, so was Gates. They're at the White House for meetings, but nobody's holding them accountable. You'd seem to think that somebody would be saying, and the president has come out and he said at one point, I think it was in last year, he came out and he said it a couple of times that, he wishes that Pfizer would show the documents that they're showing him. Oh, yeah, we'd like to see those too, because chances are Pfizer's lying. Because they've lied so much. They didn't want us to see the documents for 75 years in 2021. So, I'm not trusting these people at all. And Scott Gottlieb, who used to be at FDA, he's on the board of Pfizer. I mean, a lot of these people, it's like a club of liars.
Oh, Gottlieb's on many boards.
Mm-hmm.
National Resilience, which manufactures the vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple other ones, and CNBC kind of forgets that information when they bring him on to make commentary about stock prices.
Every time he used to be a regular on Face the Nation because he was a commentator for Face the Nation every Sunday. And the truth of the matter was, it's the messaging. I mean, they were successful at winning this battle. Okay, because even though it was a disaster, at the same time, they didn't win the war. What they wanted to do was to have a seasonal mandated coronavirus, quote unquote, vaccination for ongoing. And Bola, and I put him in the book, he said as early as spring of 2021 that they would probably have to have seasonal shots in the future because that was their game plan. And we know from David Morton, who worked for Fauci, who was indicted in the last 6 months, that he put into his documents, and I put this in the book, how Fauci was focused on the universal vaccinations. That was the code word for the seasonal mandated coronavirus vaccinations in the future. So this was their business model all along. So for people to think that they're going to walk away from the fields without having their coffers filled, they're out of their minds because they're just going to wait for the next emerging pathogen to set this thing in motion. That's why this has to be examined now. That's why we have to get to the truth, because they're not going to give up the money on this. It's too big.
Well, so Christine, when is this book coming out?
It's coming out this year, not the next century. It was delayed, and it was delayed because Trump won. Bobby was appointed HHS. More documents were going to surface. And so I took it up as far as I possibly could. And we'll probably have hard copies. I think Simon & Schuster is actually doing the distribution of it. And they're pushing it for November for the bookstores. But we do have the pre-sales for it. And I'm hoping I have to get it. I have to read it one more time And then I told them, I said, put it into paperback because it takes less time to get this out. So hopefully we're going to have it very, very soon. I expect to see a copy of it by July 1st.
Could I suggest that you send a box of books to the DOJ, courtesy of, or to Todd Blanche?
I don't think Todd Blanche is going to be the one to do it. I think we're going to have to. I was hoping that my friends in Australia were trying to put together a COVID inquiry like they did for the Catholic Church down there. And I gave them some information in 2016, but they're running into, all kinds of problems. There is a case that's in the Netherlands, and Bola and from Pfizer and Gates actually are defendants in that case with some other people. The judge in that case has ruled that Gates and Bola can have their depositions taken. So right now, I'm putting my bet on the Netherlands case, but I'm not giving up on Australia. And to me, it doesn't matter where anybody gets prosecuted, anybody's held accountable. I want people to be, I want the prosecutors to step up to the plate at this point.
Let me ask one question I haven't really heard anybody else ask. Has there been any new, or have you encountered any new booster injuries since, say, 2024? People who maybe didn't get the shot, but then they got it in 2024 and got injured post 24. My question is based on the idea that maybe they just subtly changed something in the shots that go out now to fix the glitch, and now they're just trying to sweep it under the rug.
I have 30 people in my life who are dead who took the shots.
I'm asking since 24.
Since 24, I haven't done the timeline on that, but what we do know is for some people who didn't have a reaction to the first round of shots, whether it's 2 for Pfizer, 2 for Moderna, when they got the booster, turbo cancer set in, and that was like 2023. We know that there's a lot of people who have had, if they have genetically, if they have something in the family, we know that if they took the shots, sometimes things would spike up. The autoimmune system for a lot of people is down. Look at one of the guys that I put in the book, Helmut Stearns. He was at Pfizer, I think he 35 years. He has come out and testified before an inquiry in Germany that the Pfizer shot never should have been on the market. And then he talks about the fact that they didn't do the research on cancer, and they didn't do the research on the pregnancy. But more horrifying was that he said that the elements, and I'm using this as a non-science person here, the elements, the recipes for the shots in the clinical trials were different for the shots that were actually injected in people. Now, if the public knew that they were accelerating the manufacturing and skipping phase 3 to produce the U.S. vaccinations, and that they were blowing out the manufacturing schedules, the clinical trial schedules, and they were changing the elements that were used in the clinical trials in the injections for human beings, I don't think people would have taken the shots. And you have to ask yourself, would you have taken it? And when you ask people in the healthcare providing industry who were COVID vax injured, who believed in medicine, who stepped up to the plate at the beginning and took the shots early and ended up being vax injured and not getting the help from their colleagues, they believed at that point in time in 2021 that they didn't have informed consent because they believed in the narrative that they're safe and effective, which was not true. They believed that they weren't going to transmit COVID, and they believed that the shots were going to prevent COVID, which we all know were lies. I mean, there is such a compounding of lies here. I think that we don't even have to wait, John, to 2024 to see if there's anything different in the shots. I think the people need to be held accountable for the actions that they actually did, because the lies, the intent can be proven because they knew back. And here's the kicker. Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, even AstraZeneca, because even though we didn't distribute AstraZeneca here, we actually manufactured it here in the United States. And we know it was in one plant, it was contaminated. I have yet to find out, but I will find out at some point, who in the United States decided to send those contaminated AstraZeneca shots to Mexico and to Canada? Because I found Canadian vaccine injured who traced their AstraZeneca shots back to the Maryland contaminated plant that was Emergence. Now, Emergence is interesting to me. Why? Because Dr. Bob Kadlec, who concocted this acceleration with Peter Marks, that the Trump administration signed off on in 2020, actually consulted for Emergence. And somehow those shots were sent to Canada. And I'd like to know who signed off on that, because at that point in time, Emergence knew that they had a contaminated plant. We have no accountability whatsoever. And that's why I think this is so serious. I firmly believe that there's criminal actions here that can be prosecuted. I think it is. There's such a compelling amount of information that this is probably bigger than the Catholic Church sex scandals. I think you can go country by country. I know that when we were trying to get copies of the contracts, it was like hitting. I thought we were going to have to literally blow up a bank vault to get some of these contracts. And when we tried to get them overseas, inevitably people would come back and say you can't have them because they're confidential. And we would even have prosecutors and we would have politicians, part of my anti-human trafficking network that I built for the last quarter of a century, asking these people for the contracts, and the government officials would say no. And then I had them go back and say to them, well, what did you rely on to allow Moderna, Pfizer, J&J to get access to our foreign, to our citizenships overseas? And inevitably they said the FDA. And when were they saying this? They were saying this in 2021. When the FDA was telling Aaron Series, we're not going to give you these documents, but for 75 years. So it was a game, it was a chessboard. They knew exactly the game here. But when we did get some of these foreign documents, these were as draconian as the CCP documents for the infrastructure in Africa and across Latin America for the last 35 years. We'll build you infrastructure, says the CCP, and you don't have to pay us tomorrow. But, when you do have to pay us, we want to have some collateral, like your port in Mombasa, things like that. And when the Pfizer, Moderna, J&J would go overseas, they wanted the same immunity that they had here in the United States for manufacturing them in the United States because of the 1986 Act. And where are we today? We are exporting vaccinations overseas, and the pharma industry wants to have the immunity that they have here in the United States because they manufactured. So our foreign policy, our Department of Commerce, our Department of Global Health and State Department, we are exporting immunity. When the hell did we decide that we're going to give immunity globally to people and that they can just inject people and use them as guinea pigs? Trump owns that now. He can't say this is Biden. He can't say that's a 1986 Act. This is what we did when we distributed COVID overseas. We didn't just say, if you order 7 million shots, we're going to deliver them in August. No, we said the Pfizer people said, no, if we change the date, you're still going to have to pay. If there's a cure for COVID, you still have to pay for the 7 million that you ordered. But we want immunity. And in some countries, they actually ask for collateral. That's how serious. I mean, this is like we legalized mafia negotiations with pharma. And we're still doing it today because we're not holding people accountable. And that's a slap on the face of us as Americans, because we have a duty to stand up and say, no, that's unacceptable. We should not be in the business of using people overseas as medical guinea pigs. We shouldn't be doing it here in the United States, but we sure as hell shouldn't create a business model that we basically can go out and kill people. Because
urban
at the
legends.
end of the day, those governments have to deal with it. And just like Canada, when we shipped the AstraZeneca shots to Canada that ended up with those people, they checked their vials back to that location, and the Canadian government isn't taking care of those people.
Well, I'm excited to read this book when it comes out, Christine. We're
And I'll
right
still
about
be
that time.
standing. I'll still be standing because I'm hell bent on trying to get these prosecutors. I mean, somebody's got to step up to the plate.
Conscience and courage. Those are two adjectives that I would apply to Christine Dolan. And
Right.
they're much needed by the entire press corps, legacy, private, citizen journalist, everyone. Everyone needs
Absolutely.
to follow that example.
Thank you, Robert. That's kind of you to say, and that's why I think we're very honored to be part of your press foundation.
Christine Dolan, author of Urban Legends, coming out soon, and Robert Morton, founder of World Tribune. You'll be able to see this interview on worldtribune.com, as well as excerpts from the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Stay tuned.
Like we
and-
did the last time with Shattered Innocence when it came out.
ASAP.
Yes.
I know.
They don't
Even previews.
Well, thank you both for your time. Have
you,
a great
guys.
day, everybody.